welcome Henk Boelman for this podcast. This is a kind of a podcast where, there was a show called as Hank and Hammy in the Microsoft Reactor. And that really gave me a dream because it's like hundreds of people watching over a course of time, and these people just giving you that right knowledge in what to be done. And there is an immense influence of developers and the developer advocacy in educating us as the developers. And a lot of times we forget the fact that there is a lot of pains that goes behind in designing and architecting such kind of content for you guys. And I'm with the person who really gave me a dream to work beyond my comfort zone. And like we just asked for a session and he's always ready with the demo and the slides. And what do you want more than that? And I think I'm so honored to do a podcast with Henks. And trust me, one of the best engineers that I can assure you to listen for 1.5 hours or 1 hour might be the podcast, but I don't know. But this is going to be the best podcast that I might have had pulled out in my podcast series. And I welcome Henk, sir. Thank you so much for giving me this podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm super excited to be here and to talk to you all.
Yes. Let's just start with your journey as a student and a professional. That's where we pave our ways into the right professional hustle. And that's where we actually tend to define what we are over a course of time. And we are struck with the reality like, hey, wait for 10 years, you'll be the best professional of what you're desiring right now. And I wanted to know what was your journey as a student and a professional, because that really can motivate hundreds of people like me.
Yeah, I think my journey is quite interesting. And I think in IT, a lot of people can relate to my kind of journey. But let me start with introducing myself. I am Henk Boelman. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft, and I'm based in the Netherlands. And today, I'm in my home office with a nice plant behind me, and I'm wearing a dark blue shirt, glasses, and I have dark hair. So my journey started as a child. I was 12 years old. I was very sick. I was in a wheelchair. And that was the moment my dad gave me a computer. So I think myself as I'm like middle-aged. I'm 40 now. So when I was 12, it was like the beginning of the 90s. I don't know how old you are, but maybe you have, maybe you remember the time that there was like no internet, or at least you didn't have internet at home. So my journey started with an old 386 computer, an old one from my dad, who just gave it to me and said, here you go, and figure out what to do with it. So that was floppy disks, so you could play those old games like Doom 1. If you were lucky, you had to install like 5 disks, so it was like 6 MB. And then you could run Windows 3.11 and DOS. And my hard disk was like 30 megabytes. So every time you want to reinstall something, you had to uninstall another one. And then it was like, can I get like that 100K of RAM more available by shutting like drivers on and off, and then you could play games. So that was really fun, and that is where my journey started. Then later on, internet came, and we started building websites, like for Netscape Navigator 2, no frames, just tables and background images and a lot of animated GIFs. And so I grew up with also fellow people at school, where we just brought our computers to a room. We did games, we made small networks, we had very slow internet. And that is how I rolled into IT, and it got my interest. After high school, I went to a technical education. So in the Netherlands, we have like 3 types of education. Okay, we have more, but there are 3 general types of education. So we have our vocabulary school, where you learn hands-on skills. Then we have like the higher education, and we have university, where you can get your master's degree. So I went to a very practical school, where we just learned how to program, how to actually make the the computers ourselves. The plates put on chips and make LEDs go on and off with serial buses. Used AutoCAD to draw those things. So I did that, and then I was kind of done when I was 17. I was like, yeah, I don't want to be at school. Just let me work. So I started working. It was the time that it was like the NT4, NT3.51 time. So there were company networks with those Exchange servers that you had to install on your server in your network, and it would fetch the email like every half an hour or every hour. So email then mostly wasn't instant. You first had to wait for your company to fetch the email, and then it would be delivered in all your mailboxes, which was actually really good for productivity because only at like the whole hour you would get email. And then you could send it back, which would not have been delivered like the next hour. It's kind of like a real email. So what I did is I dropped out of school because it was like, yeah, not my thing anymore to sit there. I was like, yeah, I just want to do that. I want to learn hands-on skills, and I want to. So I went to this company that I think it is now called. It's called consultancy. So and I became a consultant for like first I started on service desks. Like, hey, my Windows doesn't start up, and then you walk to the person and you put it on and off, and then you go back to your place. But in the meanwhile, I started doing those Microsoft exams, like on network administration, Exchange. So I really went into system management in networking and firewalls. We didn't really have firewall. We had Microsoft proxy server in between. So I did that for a while, and that was pretty good. Did that for a year or 5. And then internet started really kicking off. Like everyone got, at least in the Netherlands, got internet connections at home. Like that you didn't have to pay for per minute, because first we were on the phone and it was really expensive, and now we get it through our television cable. That was like the first one. You pay a monthly fee and you have like kind of unlimited internet access. So websites started to pop up. So I moved to creating those websites, and then I started studying media technology. It was back then a new study where we were focused on like kind of the intersection of media, programming, and business, which was pretty cool because they learned you how to set up a company. They also learned you how to make videos, like how to put your camera. They even learned you how to mix bands in concert halls. But it is also great to mix your own audio now. So now still, after like, I think it's 20 years ago, when I go to a studio and I have to mix people's audio, I kind of remember, oh yeah, that was that. I have to pull this, and also how to edit video. So that was actually pretty cool. And from there, I started making websites. Of course, I again didn't finish the school because I got a job offer. Actually, I sticked around at my summer job because I went to this really cool company where they made like a lot of cool websites, and they were very experienced people. So I learned to program more and do more media, make more websites from those people there. So I dropped out again and then started making websites. We made like really big websites back then. That was really cool. Then I started my own company for a while. Like I think 8 years I ran my own company. Had like 10 people. We made websites, had a lot of fun. I could travel and make websites on the way, which was even more fun. I made a lot of websites from internet cafes in India. That was pretty nice. And then this was all outside of the Microsoft stack, because I started working on PHP, on Linux, the MySQL, the whole LAMP stack. So that is what we were focusing on. And after a while, I sold the company, traveled for a long time, came back, and wanted to look for a job and learn a new skill. And that is the time when I started to focus more on .NET, on the whole Windows stack again, and starting to make there. I learned to use and program against Umbraco. My favorite CMS still is. I'm still an Umbraco MVP. And that was kind of the whole part where that was the time in my life where I started moving from doing things like just programming, doing my job, and be successful in that, to starting to share my knowledge and actually learn what a user group was. Before I never even heard that there was a user group or conferences. So being part of this Umbraco community, Dutch Umbraco community, I started to learn about, hey, I can go to a user group and learn new things and talk with people outside of my bubble about technology and what they are doing, sharing ideas. I started to present myself. I was so nervous the first time I presented. It was really, really horrible. We got up in traffic jam. So we were even too late for our presentation. So I was already nervous and I had to run up on stage and do my session about DevOps because that was my topic then. So, but a lot of fun. And from there, I went to conferences, learned to talk more. So I learned .NET, learned the CMS, learned how to deploy that, do DevOps continuous delivery, because when I made websites, we just copy pasted it or just used FTP to upload our websites and overwrite the PHP file and pray in production. But that changed, of course, over time, how we did things. And now we set up these continuous integration pipelines. And that was like kind of the moment where it was like, yes, this knowledge needs to be shared with everyone on how we do that, because it takes a lot of time to figure it all out by yourself. So if you can give someone a jump start on how to do those things, that would be really, really good for everyone. And get some feedback, of course, like, hey, Henk, you're doing that wrong. So after like 6-7 years, I worked with that company. I started to move, learned what an MVP was. Like we're talking about Microsoft MVPs. I didn't even know that existed until I think 6 years ago. So we started to organize user groups, started to interact with more MVPs, got closer to Microsoft. My interest for AI came about in 2017, when I first went to a big conference in the UK called NDC London. My company sent me there, so I was lucky to have the privilege of going there. And there was a Microsoft speaker, Jennifer Marsman, who actually was talking about cognitive services. And I always thought, because I didn't finish school, didn't do all the math and all the factors and spatial things, and I still struggle a lot with those kind of things. That was the first moment I realized that, hey, I can use AI in my solutions, because that cognitive service just transformed it, that you add intelligence by calling REST APIs. So you can have the benefits of the AI, like doing object detection, doing things with speech, which before were like not possible because you had to train your own models and embed them all in your software, and it was always really complicated. But now it was just calling a service, which I think most of developers call a lot of REST APIs to make your solution great. Then I started talking within the company about it, starting to organize external meetups, started organizing conferences. And then also in 2018, we started the first global AI bootcamp, which was like a bigger success than I could ever imagine, because I was just sitting here and I sent out a few emails, and then people started joining from all over the world. We reached like 80 venues all over the world that were doing the same thing at the same time. We recorded keynotes, and that is how I got into connection with Microsoft. Got rewarded MVP a year later, and when there was a job opening on our cloud developer advocate team, which I worked a lot with because of the Global AI Bootcamp. We transformed the bootcamp in the Global AI community, started to organize more events. And what I always found so cool about that team was they were there to help you be successful. So they gave guidance like, hey, we think this would be a suitable piece of content. How can we help? And that was so extremely cool that I just was like, yeah, I want to do that too. Because as an MVP, you do that too for everyone, but you're limited in your time. You always have to do it outside of work, in the evening, on your Sundays. So I really wanted to join that team. And I got hired. So now my job is to help all developers, mostly my focus is developers, to be successful with AI on Azure. So that is how we do it by talking about it, by running workshops, by writing content, looking up things for people. Like, hey, we want to solve this problem. And then I'm mostly, sometimes I'm like, yeah, I don't know how to do that. I never done that. But then we have our connections to the product teams who are making the things. And then you are being that bridge between like the developer and the product teams. And we bring back feedback because sometimes we just make the wrong thing or we make the right thing. And that is good to know as a company. So I'm also here if you have feedback, like you're missing features, you want features to work differently in the AI suite. You can talk to me, and then I'm trying to understand what you want, what your use case would be, and then I will make a case for it at our product teams.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is all about, because a lot of times we miss the basic understanding of what is that fundamental. Fundamental still remains constant, but that is the most key factor that defines your entire architecture. You can say something like Kubeflow is used in MLOps, but Kubeflow is still the same DNA of that still has the same DNA of the Kubernetes. Kubernetes still has the same DNA of Borg and Omega. The fundamental still remains the same. But, when we hype up with using a lot of jargons, right? Jargons like, hey, there is AI ops coming in the industry. There is a lot of trends which are happening. But I feel that everybody has adopted AI as their solution. That AI is like go-to solution for everything. Like if nothing works, there is reinforcement learning at all. But what do you feel about the solution that we are building right now? That solution which is already been existing right there. You told about the Azure Cognitive Services. That's a pretty great example of a solution which is already existing. But there are some techniques like CNN, DNN, which are still existing. But I really want your view on what do you feel about the solution of AI that is existing today?
Yeah. So what I focus on is how developers can use those toolings. I'm not a data scientist, so how I see myself in this big AI landscape is a facilitator for data scientists and help it to be maintainable and sustainable. Because we all know, like I gave the example in the old days, I would FTP something to production and pray it would work because I was only one running it. Now we have the problems that models are running in production and someone needs to know how the model was built, which data was used, how is it trained, which networks. And if someone does that on a local machine, the laptop breaks down or the person goes away and moves to a next company, all that knowledge is lost. So I think that is one of the biggest things companies need to do now, is to productionalize their machine learning workflows. From like kind of the research thing where you research, hey, this might work, this might predict something, and yeah, get that into a workflow, like the same thing we did with the whole DevOps transition. So now to say we can call it AI ops, we call it ML ops, we call it DevOps for machine learning, but basically it is caring as a group for what it is, because I see models always as part of the solution. Because if I train a model on TensorFlow, I'm just getting 2 files. And still, I need to write software around it. If it's Python, or I can convert it to Onyx, run .NET. It can be PyTorch, TensorFlow. It doesn't matter, it doesn't do anything. It needs to be embedded in software. So you need a developer that can write good software, because if you write an API that is not performing, then the model can be that good, but nobody is going to use it. So, and I see now the trend that those teams are starting to work together. So you have the data scientists being part of the whole DevOps team. And that is what I think should be done. So you build it together. That the data scientist also is going to know, oh, my model is going to be used in this type of solution. This is the input data. This is how we can scale it. And then every time you redeploy it, then it should be run through tests. We should see if the model is still performing the same. And we probably want to update the model, but the software can still be done. It needs to be redeployed. We want to have these kind of things that we can test it out, like A/B testing. Maybe run it to both models, see if it changes, or half traffic there, half the traffic there. So that is something, and that is something that we are investing in like in our Azure Machine Learning our Azure Machine Learning offering, where you can train those models, but the whole solution helps you manage it and work together.
Yeah, because workflows are something which is so cool these days, because not everybody has the same architecture, everybody has the same approach. Like, it's all skewed. It's like let's just go on with the existing modules and the algorithms. That might be an approach of a person like me who can't afford tens and hundreds of dollars on just optimizing things. There are some frameworks like Optuna, Hypertune. There are amazing tool sets. But I want your view on architecting a solution today, because there is no one solution which is going to fetch you that right thing. Because I feel like data set is so dynamic that you might have trained it for one, but like there is something else which might pop up all of a sudden. Like this pandemic, what we saw last year was something which was never seen earlier at all. And the data set, the data pattern which was seen was something which was different over a course of time. And everybody had to migrate for the new culture. Everybody had to listen to something new over a course of time. So I want your views on architecting an AI solution today. How different should it be in order to give us that sustainable AI, reliable AI, and also AI for the good? Because sometimes there are some adversaries which we might find in any of the deployed models or else on a production system. So how are we supposed to architect a solution for an AI today?
Yeah. So if we're talking about architecting or training models, we just want to have some principles in place before you start doing it. And then I'm talking more about responsible AI. So always the first question I always ask is if you want to solve a problem, because AI solves problems. So you always start with a question, like what do you need to be answered? And remember, it is always part of a bigger solution. And AI models at the moment are very specific. So I always see like you build this big software solution. There is a function that does that one thing. You have something in, something comes out. And that you can either write it in code or you can use a model for that. That's kind of it. Like if you want to do face detection, I can write something that goes in every pixel and then make up shapes. Or I can use an AI model that will just tell me, hey, it's most likely that there is the face in between those pixels. So that is how abstract I see it. So in that function just answers one of the questions instead of face yes or no. So then when you start crafting the model, you're going to ask yourself some questions like, is our model inclusive? Is it going to detect all the faces, for instance? Is it transparent? Can we explain how it actually works? Can we trace it? And who is actually accountable for if it is not doing the right thing, making wrong predictions? What I always tell engineers, because engineers, we are still developers, we're still the ones that actually probably hit commit or deploy it. Is this ethical? Do you think this should be done? So always as a team think about this. Do we actually need this? And so on. So there is this framework to do that. That is called the FATE framework. And you can find it on microsoft.com/responsible AI. And there we actually go in and about fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. And there is this really cool framework on put responsible AI into action. And we have a lot of specialists at Microsoft that use those principles. So I hope that answers your question, or do you want to be more into the technical things, how we would
Yeah,
build
that
it?
would be great. That would be great because a lot of times we miss that thing. Because in one of your slide, I still remember there is a developer who has his own favorite tools, and there is a developer who has his own favorite techniques to deploy a model, and there is still an underlying complexity of what should be the next step. That's what I really see in all your sessions. So I just wanted to realize, like, what are some of the canonical problems that are still existing according to you? Because forget the fact that there are hundreds of frameworks today, but I wanted to really understand what are some of those which are yet to be solved.
Yeah. I have to think a little bit about that, how I would do it. So I use Azure Machine Learning to train my custom models. But first, I always ask myself, do I actually need to create the model myself? Because if you're going to create a model yourself, you're getting a lot of trouble on your neck. You have to do it all and you have to do it well. So some problems are already solved. And you can just pick out a model that will do it, that has been tested, that has been approved, that has been used by hundreds of people, like for instance our cognitive services. So if you want to do something like object detection or text analysis, translation, speech recognition, then you don't have to do that yourself. Even if you want to do custom object detection, like from your own products or things, you can use custom vision. And that will actually give you the model. It will give you even a Docker container with a ready-to-go API in it, so you can run it in your own infrastructure. And actually some of our cognitive services you can also pull out and just run in your own infrastructure. They need some connectivity to the cloud because they still will send their billing information every 15 to 30 minutes. And if they miss 3 times, they will stop working. Unless you contact the product teams, like for instance, if you're a cruise ship and you want to have those models in your local data center on your cruise ship, then of course there are also solutions for that. First, you have your question, you have the problem you want to solve, then which tooling am I going to use? Framework, I don't know the ins and outs of the frameworks. I know that some frameworks are better in solving specific problems I don't know which one, because like I said, I'm not a data scientist. So that is the part I mostly to give to a data scientist that studied it, that knows what they're doing. But what you can do is offer the data scientist the infrastructure, like Azure Machine Learning, on how to do that. So have the data set versioned, because we all need to find our data back. Have everything logged that the data scientist is doing, because you try out a lot of things, and use the cloud to accelerate that training. So then when the model is done, so the data scientist chose the right framework, studied it, tried out very different things, because if you run it on Azure Machine Learning, you can compare the models, you can compare the accuracy, you see how it is being trained if you do it well. Then you register those models in model management. And we do that with our software, with our NuGet packages. So we also do that with our models. So everyone can pull out a model. Not everyone, of course, it is secured, but you can pull out a model and use it in your software. And from there, you can start thinking on how to deploy it. Like, are you going to create like your own cognitive service? Are you going to have it in an API, which you're going to be updating all the time? But maybe you're going to put it in a mobile app. Then that would not be so cool to send your camera feed on a 4G connection constantly to an endpoint. So then you have to think of getting your model ready for mobile. Not every model is running on a mobile very well. So you have iPhone, you have to convert it to Core ML. You can do TensorFlow Lite on some mobiles that can run in the browser, which is pretty cool. So yeah, it's always the case, of course, that architect says it depends of your output. Are you going to run a Windows app? Then probably you want to have an Onyx model that is there. But yeah, then the same software principles apply as that you would build normal software.
So, but I wanted to understand what are some of the worst practices that you saw today, because because a lot of times when I think of my code, which is like probably 2 years before, because I think 2.5 to 3.5 years before, that's where my machine learning interest started. And that's where I had my screen. Half of the screen was documentation, half of the screen was a console which had a compute cluster attached to a cloud somewhere else. But I wanted to know, because a lot of times we talk a lot of things, like we talk of optimizing this model, because there is a trade-off. If you want too much of performance, probably you might have to get the fact that your models might not be that secure over a course of time. Of course, Onyx has solved that. Onyx has really made sure that model deployment is unique in all platforms and all at any scale. Deployment at scale is never a problem within Onyx at all. But I wanted to know, what are some of the worst and the best practices that you saw today? Because you talk with a lot of developers, you talk with a lot of startups, you have built a startup and you have seen the approaches which have been given. I know that was not machine learning, but you should have had seen some of the worst and the best practices that are still continued even today. So I wanted to know what are all those all about today?
Yeah, so I don't know, like I said, on how to craft a model. But what I know is, and what I've seen, because I was just starting in that period that we were shifting to like training in the cloud, and that it became better. Is that first, if you start very locally and you don't think about your architecture before, it is really hard to implement it afterwards. It's not impossible, but that was my experience from a few years ago when I did my project. Mostly you don't have time to do it afterwards. So you have to kind of work with your data scientists, make sure they're not on an island include them in the whole project. What are you building? How are we going to update it? Have those questions and discussions before you start making it. It's the same with software. You think first about your architecture. What are you going to use? Why are we going to use it? How are we going to work together? And now include the data science. That was my biggest mistake, because I was just waiting for a model to magically arrive and then would solve anything. And I didn't realize that the model would actually run in Python, and I was doing it in .NET, my solution. And then I was like, yeah, how are we going to do that? And then we solved it by making it in an API and setting up those things, but that are problems we try to solve afterwards. And that might be my inexperience, because I was a software architect back then, but it was my first AI project. So that was really, it was a hard lesson. That it also works for that case. And also, I think we used some models that could have actually been picked off the shelf. Like, we could have used cognitive services in some places, which would have saved us a lot of time, instead of reinventing and building our own thing.
Yeah, that's true, because there are already existing solutions. Like if you go to the super glue, there are hundreds of models which are already being listed out there. You can use them, you can start building an NLP model, even though you don't have a complete knowledge of NLP. That's where transfer learning and everything. Yeah, you brought a valid point, by the way. And last question, because you have been educating developers for a very long time now, and that's what really drove you to work beyond your comfort zone. So I wanted to ask you this question regarding what's the influence of developer advocacy in the relations today in educating all the developer ecosystem? Like, it's like today, and probably a person who has never touched a computer want to achieve something in AI today. I just wanted to know what is the influence of education through the developer and the developer advocacy, because Henk and Amy show is doing pretty amazing, because it's a bit of AI, but it gives a lot of insights. So I wanted to know what's the influence of DevRel and developer advocacy in educating the developer ecosystem.
Yeah, so I will obviously talk for myself how I see it, and that is this technique, the AI, the services we want to use. And when you realize that everyone is in a different learning state, instead of like, hey, I'm going to broadcast this and everyone has to comply to this. So it's a good example. The Bit of AI show with Amy and me, which will start again next week on Thursday, is all about careers. It is for people that are maybe don't know what AI is. They're like me. In the beginning, I was always like, I can't work on an AI project, and highlighting all the different roles and inspiring people like, hey, I'm interested in AI. Other people have come this way. I can also do it. I can also get into the AI space. I can also be part of that movement. It is not something for a very specific group of people. And some parts you realize you can't. I know I will never work in AI research, because then I will have to go and study math and to the university, and that's just not my thing. But building and deploying and helping in that part of AI, that is for me. So within developer relations, we focus on very specific, maybe we can call it groups of people that are in different states. So I have introduction services that will talk about cognitive services, where we talk about all the possibilities, that all the things you can do out of the box with AI. I talk to people to explain what data science is if you want to do it. I talk to operations and developers how to do machine learning and DevOps together, like explain that, how to build this into DevOps pipelines. Um, so that's it. So you have to kind of pick the audiences, and then we can go from beginner um, up to level 400 in Microsoft terms. And we have to make sure that the documentation is up to date, that everything is there. And because we make these presentations, make these demos and workshops, I mostly go to the documentation because I also don't know everything by the top of my head. And then I'm like, oh yeah, okay, we can explain this better. Maybe we should twist it. And then we talk to the docs teams to make it better. So what we do is kind of pave the way for developers to be successful and be there to answer questions, to help, to point to the right direction, to connect with the product groups.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for these great insights, because a lot of times it's not about speaking too much of neural network architecture and things like that. Forget the fact that they are existing in the world of AI today. What if these concepts go absolute? Because neural network is still a black box to the world right now. And you are supposed to build yourself as a good developer, good engineer who can architect these solutions. I think these were very great insights for all of us. And thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. And you will probably share my details in the podcast. So if anyone has any questions about how to get started with AI on a Microsoft stack, then please reach out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.